There you guys. So I did something not well. I wonder if this would be out of the ordinary for me, but I guess for most people it would be out of the ordinary. The other night I decided I was going to go see Oculus by myself at a 10:40 showing. And how this came about was that I was just done having some dinner with family that was in town, and I was driving on the highway that I would normally drive up, and it's past a movie theater that I would normally go to. So I was sort of thinking in my head, well, I really want to see Oculus because, in a very similar fashion as Sinister, I had only seen a preview of Oculus roughly a week to 2 weeks before it was going to be released. And I had not heard of it before. I did not know really much about it other than what I had just seen in the trailer and maybe one or two other teasers. So I was very curious, and I'm like, you know what, this actually looks kind of interesting. The lead up reviews on Rotten Tomatoes, I think it was at 71%. And so, for horror films, 71, that's actually pretty good for a horror film. Normally, even the good ones are probably in the 50s and 60s. I figured, you know what, it looks generally interesting. I want to give it a shot. I couldn't really find a friend that was willing to go on the day that I wanted to go, so I was just driving by and I'm like, I wonder if there's a showing this late. It was about 10:30 at night. And so I parked in the movie theater. It took me about 5 minutes to find a parking spot because the place was packed. And I opened up my iPhone and I was checking the times for the particular theater, and next showing was at 10:40. I'm like, perfect, that's great timing. And I sat down for like 2 minutes. I'm like, do I really want to go see this movie by myself? Because it looked genuinely terrifying to me. And I'm like, let's just go, balls to the wall, let's go in. So go in, buy my ticket, sit down. And I have to say, I really enjoyed Oculus. It has its flaws. It does have issues. I'm not going to say it's a perfect horror film. I think a 70% is actually probably a very accurate rating for this movie. It certainly has its issues. There are certain logical fallacies that I think, well, why are they there in the first place? Those kinds of issues that you normally have with horror films, but to a certain extent, they don't bother me as much because the movie has done such a good job of setting up the rules of what's going on, and they've done such a good job of setting up their characters that, you know what, I can take that leap. I can have that suspension of disbelief, and I'm like, you know what, I'm along for the ride. I want to see how this turns out. And within 5 minutes of the movie, you are genuinely hooked because the first 5 minutes of the movie start off with pretty much exactly what you expected in the movie, because it's almost like a filmmaker's thought, you know what, we know you saw the trailer, it's the reason you came to the movie, so we're going to give you exactly what you want to see right at the beginning of the movie. Because normally in horror films, it takes at least halfway through the movie before anything supernatural starts to pop up. At least in the supernatural horrors, usually it takes about halfway through the movie before you really start to see things happening. With this one, right out of the gate, you are on the edge of your seat. There's a ton of suspense. There's a palpable tension that just starts off right at the beginning of the movie, and you're on the edge of your seat the rest of the time. It has a great atmosphere. Acting is really well done. Pacing is a little bit quick in the beginning, but once you set into a bit of a rhythm about maybe 20-25 minutes in, it starts to even out a little bit more, and it starts to even out, and everything starts to feel like it has a much better flow, so you don't quite notice it as much later on. I'm just going to say in the beginning, the pacing is just a tad bit quick. I kind of want to just jump right into spoiler territory right now because there's a lot of detail in this movie. There's a lot of things that I can't really talk about if I don't want to spoil anything for people. So if you just wanted my general reaction to the movie, I think it's pretty dang good. I honestly think it's a really interesting premise. We've had horror movies that focused on reflections and mirrors before. There was a movie called Mirrors that was absolutely terrible. I thought that movie was awful. This is so much better than that movie. Like, if you think this is just gonna be another Mirrors, it's not. It's so much more well thought out. It's a lot more cerebral, I think, than you think it'll be going in. Probably the best word I can use to describe the movie actually is it's very Hitchcockian. It has a lot of the same elements that you would expect in a Hitchcock movie. There's a sense of claustrophobia because most of the film takes place in one setting, which is in this house. It has a lot of dark, shadowy elements to impend danger, which Alfred Hitchcock is amazing at using. The stairs as a motif for mystery. You're not really sure about, is this actually something supernatural going on, or is this something just, is someone just going crazy? And for a long time in the movie, that's all you're kind of thinking is this just a family of psychos, or is this, something genuinely weird happening? So I think if you want to go see a movie which has some really well thought out ideas, that is very kind of unique in this sort of market right now for horror films, I would say go see it. I don't think it's a waste of your time. I think it's genuinely a good movie. But I am gonna jump into spoilers now. So, general plot summary of the movie: two children of a family later on in their life reacquire a mirror that they think is responsible for the death of their parents, who, according to the police reports, their father tortured and killed their mother, and then the son shot the dad. But it was mainly in self-defense. What they do when they acquire the mirror is they set it up in the house that they grew up in. And they set it up with a ton of security cameras. They set it up with they set them up with alarm clocks and this trigger switch, so that, every hour or so there's a possibility that the mirror will be destroyed. And so there's this very elaborate setup. And what they're trying to do is, or at least what the daughter is trying to do, is prove that the mirror is supernatural, that it does have this power, and that it was responsible for what happened to their family and other families. And she goes into this very long exposition dump about her evidence for this thing, and she talks very convincingly. Like, she talks like she's a conspiracy theorist, and it's very well done. And then she has a lot of back and forth dialogue with her brother, because her brother just got out of a mental institution based on the events of when they were children. And, he's trying to tell her that she's effing crazy. There's all these things in psychology that would explain the way she remembers things and why she thinks she remembers it that way. And it seems like genuinely natural conversation. The dialogue is very well written. It doesn't sound forced or contrived. Even though it's a lot of exposition that they have to get out, it sounds convincing. And it's just believable to me. So I was just enthralled, especially with all the information that they're giving. I'm like, I kind of wish that, there was a website that they had formed, almost like a viral campaign, where I could go onto the website and look at all the information that she had brought up in the movie. So there's a lot of great setup, and it's a genuinely creepy atmosphere that they build up in this movie. As the movie goes on, they're in this environment. It's very well controlled. She has her fiance calling her every hour or so, and they make sure that they're well hydrated, that they have food, and they basically try to prove that the mirror is causing certain things to happen, that it affects them in certain ways, and that there's a physicality to it, because they remember seeing things when they were children. They remember seeing this woman, and one of the kids remembers that there was a woman that no one could explain, versus the other who thinks it was their dad having an affair. And so it just kind of proves that, one of them remembers things this way and the other one remembers things that way. Is it genuinely real? Or is everything a hallucination? Are these people just genuinely screwed up from what happened? What's really interesting is that the brother character, who does play a bit of the skeptic, usually in these movies the skeptic is skeptical for the wrong reasons, because usually if you're faced with a certain amount of information, there's no way you can be skeptical about it anymore. It's like, you just can't be. And that's usually the most frustrating part with supernatural horror films for me, is that people who are the skeptics, they wait too long to start believing the people who are saying, it's ghosts, or it's this, or it's that. In this movie, the brother is reasonably skeptical, and he gives reasons why he's skeptical. But then once stuff actually starts happening, he is not skeptical anymore. He totally believes it, and it's a perfectly rational point where anyone would no longer be skeptical. Like, leading up to that, anyone would be skeptical. Anyone would not believe what this girl is saying. But then once you hit that exact point, and there is a single moment where that it's not just them going crazy, that it's not just in their heads anymore. It's something that's supernatural. he's like, holy crap, she's right. And from then on, the movie really does utilize flashbacks actually incredibly well. Basically, half of the movie takes place of when they were kids, and it sets up, what happened when they were kids, what happened to their parents, what potentially drove their parents to insanity, why their father did these things, what happened to their mother. And they utilize it so well because each time that they go to a flashback, it perfectly sort of mirrors or reflects in a modern day scene, and so they intercut with each other very well. But there's also a lot of points where like you have because it's all occurring in the same house. It's the house that they grew up in, and so you'll see like the smaller version of the daughter walk by in a hallway, and then the older version will be like staring at her younger self as she walks around a corner, and so then she turns her head and it's back in the setting of the older house. Like, there's a lot of great transitions like that, and the transitions do eventually get confusing, but it's confusing because you legitimately don't know if things are reality anymore, if the mirror is messing with them, and the mirror is genuinely trying to defend itself against them at some point because, again, spoilers, the mirror is genuinely supernatural, so it is trying to mess with them in their minds, and it is making them see things that aren't really there, trying to trick it so that it can defend itself. So there's certain points where it will convince, them to stand in front of the mirror. So it's incredibly complex and very complicated. It's a bit hard to keep up with, but I wouldn't say that the ending is all that surprising. I kind of thought this when I was in the movie theater, and I watched actually Brad Jones's review, his midnight screening review of Oculus. What was it? I watched his after I had seen the movie, and so I already formed my opinion of the movie. But he described it very well. The ending of the movie is actually very similar to the Blair Witch 2 ending, Book of Shadows, except it's done so much better. Like, Blair Witch 2 was a god-awful movie, but this ending, it's virtually the same, but it's done in a much more... It doesn't feel like a slap to the audience, because in Blair Witch 2, that was a slap. It's like, it's insulting our intelligence because it just came out of nowhere, and it's like, oh, we're just going to throw a twist in for the sake of throwing a twist. Whereas in this movie, it makes 100% sense, and you can almost see it coming, because at that point, it does kind of get predictable, and you know the movie's only going to end one of two ways, and so it's likely it's going to end one way. So that really is a tiny bit of a letdown, that you can kind of predict where it's going, but at the same time, it doesn't feel like they misled you. It doesn't feel like they just turned around and threw something at you that didn't make any sense. It all made perfect sense within the context of the movie that they had set up, and within the rules of the universe that they had set up. There's a lot of great scares in this movie. If you're the type of person that likes a lot of tension and you're not really sure when they're going to show something a little bit creepy, it does rely a tad bit too much on stingers, which does kind of bother me, because that's usually the part of horror films that I think are the most overused and I think the most poorly utilized. Like, they don't quite know how to use them, so they just throw them during every scare. This one doesn't quite do it in all the scares of the movie, but it is in there more often than I would like it to be. So I think there's only one point in the movie where there's a false scare, like, a jump scare that isn't really caused by anything scary, and that one particular scare just bothered the living shit out of me. But the rest of them, they're all genuine. They're all absolutely terrifying when they happen. Like, there's one really great moment where where the brother, I should say. Okay, I have to give them names now because I feel really bad that I'm just referring to them as like daughter and son. So the son's name is Tim, and the daughter's name is Kaylee. And so what Tim's younger self, they're told when they're younger, don't go into Dad's office, that he really wants the kids to stay out of the office because that's where the mirror is and it's possessing him, and he's very defensive about being in that room. So the kid goes in to check on his dad really late at night one time, and the kid opens the door and he sees this woman who has, the white eyes, that I'm sure that you've seen in the trailers. She's like standing right behind his dad, And so she looks straight at him, and then she moves, and then she like pulls behind the door and like smiles at him. It's the creepiest fucking thing I've ever seen. I really like moments like that. Like it's those kind of moments where it's like it's genuinely terrifying, and it sticks with you. And I think I had a not really a nightmare, but it was sort of in a mental image of when I was sleeping last night. Like I was kind of aware of the fact that I had just seen a horror film, and those images were just kind of floating around in my head when I went to sleep. So it's those kind of things that I think that really make those kinds of movies. And a lot of people, if that kind of stuff doesn't scare you, then there's no way I can convince you that, it's a good movie, because that's ultimately why you go to see horror films, is to be scared. And if that didn't scare you, then that's not a good horror film to you. But to me, it's the fact that they're good scares on top of complexity, and on top of interesting character development, on top of the psychological aspect of it. Like, to me, it's all just really well combined with each other. I do kind of want to talk about the light bulb scene, because that's probably the scene that most people remember from the trailer. And I remember when I saw the trailer, I watched that scene and I was like, I have to know how on earth that plays out in this movie. When it happens, there is this cringe-inducing moment where it's like, oh my god, she just ate a light bulb. And it's almost a solid minute on the fact that she just bitten into a light bulb. Everything's very slow, very deliberate, but it never feels drawn out. So like she pulls it away from her hand, there's a tiny bit of blood, and so she like spends the next like 40 seconds like prying this piece of glass that's like this big out of her mouth. And she's just in shock, in horror. It's the most disturbing thing ever. And when her brother shows up, she has this horrified look on her face, and big spoiler, it turns out it's a hallucination. The mirror is tricking her in her own mind. And it's sort of the point where we realize that the mirror can manipulate what they see and what they think is happening to them. And so from that point on, you're never quite sure if something is real or not. You're never sure, like, are they actually walking down this hallway? Are they going outside? Are they interacting with this person, or is that person just a hallucination? There's a lot of points in this movie where they're on the phone with people, and the person that they're talking to is actually a projection of the mirror. The mirror is talking to them basically through that cell phone, because they'll call like 3 people. They all sound the same. They all say the same thing. Everything's sort of a repetition of these things that the mirror is getting them to say, and it's the creepiest sort of thing to know that you can't escape, you can't get out. So once they put themselves in that situation, they can't take themselves out of it, and that's the creepy part. It's like, yeah, why would you put yourself in that situation to begin with? But at the same time, once they're in, they made a stupid decision, and now they can't back out of it. And that's kind of the interesting part about this. And you're genuinely curious about where this movie's going to go at the end of it. There's a great amount of reflection between what happened in the past versus what's happening in the present. There is some genuinely horrifying performances from the actors, though. Like, and I don't mean horrifying in a negative way. I mean in a positive way. Like, I think Katie Sackhoff is the actress who plays the mother. I think the mother's name is Marie. She goes real off the deep end when she's going crazy. Like, she plays crazy very well, and it's sort of like what you would expect to see when you see sort of like a demon possession movie, except it's just so hits that mark where, like, you see the terrified version of her real self, and then the possessed version of her, and it's such a flip, and it feels so eerie and creepy, and it's all she does is smile and look a certain way, and she attacks people just kind of off like that. And also the way the dad, I think the actor's name is Rory Cochrane, he does a really good job of also playing that line between, is he just going crazy, or is he being manipulated by the mirror and the things and all this sort of stuff. There is some genuine interest and intrigue about, what is happening in a person's mind when something like that happens to them. And I think that's always an interesting thing to talk about in a horror film that's based on the supernatural, because a lot of the times people will just sort of offhandedly accuse someone of being crazy, but they don't really talk about why they think they're crazy. I mean, sure, certain things just sound absolute bonkers, but they don't actually talk about the real psychology behind it. They don't talk about the situation, why they might be thinking that. In this movie, they really explore that. Like, they talk about the fact that the mother was probably starting to go a little bit nuts because she thought that her husband was having an affair, or the fact that the dad was really stressed out by the wife getting really suspicious and starting to act crazy. Like, there's a lot of these things that sort of could legitimately explain why someone would start to act a certain way and act out in a certain way. It's all very logical in a way where it's all very crazy at the same time. It's very logically crazy, I guess, if that's the best way of putting it. There's a great amount of shots in this movie that I really appreciated in terms of its cinematography, the way shots are blocked and set up. Because, again, there are those great transitions where they go from a flashback to present day or present day to the past. And it all flows very naturally. And I remember in the theater, I'm sitting by myself in the theater, and I have no one sitting around me, but there's like, a couple sitting in front of me, a couple sitting 3 or 4 seats the other way, and then, a couple people sitting behind me. And at certain moments when they're just doing transitions and it's, the older version watching the younger version of themselves in their memory, or even when the mirror is making them hallucinate, there were people who were genuinely like they would seize up, because all it is the camera is following the younger version of that character. And then as it gets to a certain point, there's the older version just standing there, and then the older version will turn their head and look at something, and then it cuts back to present day. And so it's fantastic transitions, and it adds to the mood of not really knowing what to expect or what you're seeing, because you don't know if it is going to be one of the spirits from the mirror. You don't know if it's a person or if it's one of the characters. It's all very confusing, but it's confusing in a very organized sort of way. I think 70%, 71% is very accurate for this movie. I kind of wish that it utilized more subtle scares, that it didn't rely so much on the stingers. I wish that the pacing in the beginning had been a bit more slower. The movie was only an hour and 45 minutes long, which to me nowadays, that's actually, like, we're used to 2-hour-long movies now, and so I feel like, you could have taken the extra 2-3 minutes to kind of spread out the beginning a little, kind of ease up on the pacing. Maybe the editing shouldn't have been so quick. Maybe add 1 or 2 scenes to develop things a little bit more, because things are just kind of thrown at us at the beginning, and we don't really know what's going on. So I kind of wish maybe they would have slowed down a little bit more. But otherwise, I think it has some genuinely interesting scares. I think the look of the spirits, beings, whatever you want to call them, from the mirror are genuinely terrifying. There's some great moments of you're not sure what characters are looking at, but they'll be staring at themselves, and then like a spirit, once they turn off the lights, just appears, and it's the creepiest thing. Like, just a lot of really creepy moments. I don't want to ruin all of them for you guys, so all I can say is if you want to see a horror film that you think might actually scare you, I think this one is pretty dang good. I think it really goes back to Hitchcockian roots, and I think it's just a tad bit smarter than what we've come to expect for horror films. I mean, usually horror films, there's certain genres that we expect of horror films. We expect either slashers, the monster that runs after you with the knife, or we expect torture porn, which this movie does have a bit of gore. I mean, it is rated R, but it's not like overt. It does have a bit of points where I'm like, I can't quite look. It's only like I'll turn my head away because I don't really like looking at that kind of stuff. But it's not like unreasonable amounts of gore. It's appropriate, I guess I would say, for the subject matter. And then there's also psychological horrors, much in the same vein as Psycho. And then you also have the supernatural horror movies. And this one is a very almost even balance of all of those, because there are some points where it becomes, a monster chasing after you because of the way that people get possessed, and so they're chasing after other people with knives, with guns, with golf clubs, and there are people genuinely chasing after you, and you have to watch your back for them, and you have to spend the whole time like running around a house trying to make sure you're not caught by somebody. There's other times where there is a tad bit of gore. I think a good chunk of the movie is spent focusing on the psychological aspects of this kind of an event, focusing on how things are misinterpreted, how our minds play with us, how our minds trick us, and then also the supernatural element, which is the biggest element, but it's interplayed very well with all the other sort of horror genres that we've come to expect in this day and age. Like those are the most common genres that we see now. It's sort of a nice balance of all of them. And they don't really work against each other like you'd think it would. You'd expect someone who's trying to jam all these different genres together to come out with a bit of a mess. And in reality, I think it's very well put together. I know that the director had actually made a short film that was based on the same premise as this. I think it was just called Part 3 Oculus or something like that. And it was sort of like this idea of he set up cameras on this mirror that he believed caused supernatural events. And this movie is just sort of an elaborated version of that short film. I'd like to actually give that short film a shot to see what the differences are, what the cast is like, what parts of the concept have changed, things like that. I'd like to give that one a shot. Oculus is the type of movie that will keep me awake at night because, I'm scared of looking at a mirror. But with something like torture porn, I'm not really scared of someone, kidnapping me and drugging me and putting me in an elaborate setup where they're gonna rip my fingernails off and or cut me and quarter me or all these sort of things. Like, I don't know, I feel like that's the reason I can watch the Saw movies, and the only parts that I don't like are the gore part, well, especially the later Saw movies. The only parts I don't like are the gore, but the arcs and the character development, the plots are very interesting. I just don't like the gore because that's not the scary part. Like, Saw I don't really see as horror movies except for the first one. The first one I see as a horror film. The rest of the series I just sort of see as like this very elaborate crime thriller. And that's why I have a very hard time with torture porn. And I feel like those are the people who say that this movie isn't scary. They don't understand the difference between disgust and being terrified, being frightened, being genuinely scared. I'm sure if anything in this movie happened to them, they would be shit out of their minds. And again, it's not necessarily that anything physically happens to people. I mean, stuff physically happens to people, but a lot of it is psychological. A lot of it is just what you think you're seeing, and that can be the most traumatizing thing. So I think that's what I take away from this, is that, there are some people who will not find it scary, but I think they're looking at it through almost an inappropriate context because they look at stuff like torture and they think that's scary, and that's not scary. That's... this movie is a lot about what you think you're seeing, what you think you aren't seeing. It's a lot of that kind of mind trick stuff. And it's part of that atmosphere and it's part of that ambiance. And it's very good with that. So I would generally recommend this movie to anyone who would be interested in it. If you watch the trailer and you thought it might be really interesting, you'll probably like it. I do have a Captain America Winter Soldier review I do want to do, although I had actually just done a podcast with a friend of mine, or with two friends of mine, I should say, where we reviewed the new Captain America movie. The podcast is called World's Best Podcast. It's mainly started up as a podcast devoted to Batman and Superman, but now they've kind of branched off into various other nerdy things, like they basically, I go onto the podcast every so often to talk about Marvel stuff because that's generally what I know the most about, and so I helped them. I was on for the Captain America Winter Soldier review with them, so if you guys are interested in that, I will leave a link to their podcast page in the description below, and but I will be doing my own review on here soon, so please look out for that. Also, another brief update, I am finally out of college. I am now an adult. I am part of the working world now. So you can expect more reviews from me because I do really enjoy doing this. I want to do a lot more of these. Probably I'll do some more discussion videos in the near future because there's a lot of movies that are coming out soon that I kind of want to discuss and talk about. So expect more videos coming out in the next little bit. That's pretty much it. I'd like to thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you later. Peace.